Peace, love, liberty, radio.
And the walls come crashing down as the war at home reaches your town. You have no choice, it's safe and clean. We all submit to the war machine.
Well, it's happening, and it is having negative effects. It is doing the complete opposite of what the lawmakers had intended. What am I talking about? Well, the minimum wage has increased in several larger cities around the country, and there's a story out of Seattle about the $15 per hour minimum wage law not actually bringing people out of poverty. And, you know, if you understand economics, then you might think one thing, but it's actually not that. It is not because people are being laid off and they can't find work. What is actually happening in Seattle, according to this report, is that there is evidence suggesting that, or rather evidence surfacing, that some workers are asking their bosses for fewer hours as wages rise. That way they don't lose their public subsidies like food stamps, child care, and rent. Full Life Care, a home nursing nonprofit, told KIRO TV in Seattle that several workers want less work. The host of the Jason Rantz show, Jason Rantz, said if they cut down their hours to stay on these subsidies because the $15 per hour minimum wage didn't actually help get them out of poverty, all you've done is put a burden on the business and given false hope to a lot of people. The twist is just one apparent side effect of the controversial yet trend-setting minimum wage law in Seattle, which is being copied in several other cities despite concerns over prices rising and businesses struggling to keep up. And it is even going to be statewide in the vampire state of New York, only for fast food workers. And that is something that some experts are saying leaves the state open for a lawsuit because it's not an across-the-board rise. It's only targeting one specific industry, and that being fast food workers. So in New York State, now they've got these things to where none of these are automatic, like, okay, tomorrow you're making $15 an hour, where today you were making $7.25. It's always these staggered sort of step-up sort of things, and I'm not sure what step they are on in Seattle, but in New York State, it's one of those things to where by like 2021, between now and 2021, the wage is going to be stepped up incrementally to $15 per hour for fast food workers. In Los Angeles, it's going to be over, I think, like the next 4 or 5 years where it goes up. And there are several other cities where they're doing this. And I do think that it's very interesting because this is certainly not a side effect that I would have guessed. I definitely would have imagined that people are going to be laid off, that younger people are going to have a harder time finding work, but I never would have imagined, or, well, I would have imagined it if somebody would have suggested it, but I'd never heard this suggested at all, that people would wind up telling their boss, I want fewer hours so I don't lose my food stamps. The story here continues. The notion that employees are intentionally working less to preserve their welfare has been a hot topic on talk radio. While the claims are difficult to track, state statistics indeed suggest State statistics indeed suggest that few people are moving off welfare programs under the new wage. Despite a booming economy throughout western Washington, the state's welfare caseload has dropped very little since the higher wage phase began in Seattle in April. In March, 130,851 people were enrolled in the basic food program. In April, the caseload dropped to 130,376. So that's a drop of less than 500 people. At the same time, prices appear to be going up on just about everything. Some restaurants have tacked on a 15% surcharge to cover the higher wages. And some managers are no longer encouraging customers to tip, leading to a redistribution of income. Workers in the back of the kitchen, such as dishwashers and cooks, are getting paid more, but servers who rely on tips are seeing their salaries decrease. And it's not actually salary, because salary would be the amount that they're getting from the business, that they're seeing their take-home pay not go up because people aren't tipping, or if they are, they're tipping less because they're having to pay more, plus there's this 15% surcharge. So the servers are really the ones that are taking a hit on this. The story here continues. Some longtime Seattle restaurants have closed altogether, though none of the owners publicly blamed the minimum wage law. Paul Guppy of the Washington Policy Center said, "It's what happens when the government imposes a restriction on the labor market that normally would not be there, and marginal businesses get hit the hardest, and usually those are small neighborhood businesses." Seattle was followed by San Francisco and Los Angeles in passing a $15 per hour minimum wage. The wage is being phased in over several years to give businesses time to adjust. The current minimum salary that someone is legally allowed to pay a worker in Seattle is $11 per hour. In San Francisco, it is $12.25 per hour. And let me just sort of explain this a little bit more, because when most people think minimum wage, they understand, like, this is the lowest that somebody can get a job, but they don't really understand what exactly that means. And I realize that sounds like a very condescending statement, but what it means when you set a wage and you're saying this is the lowest that anyone is legally allowed to hire someone, you are telling them that if you pay your child an allowance, and it's based on the number of hours that they do household chores, legally you cannot give them less than, right now in Seattle, $11 per hour. Even though nobody's going to take it that far. But they might say, okay, the neighborhood kid that comes over to cut your grass, it took him 2 hours to cut your grass. You only paid him $15 an hour, or $15 to cut the grass. It took him 2 hours. That's $7.50 an hour. You're now having to pay a fine, go to court, and all these other things. What it does is it uses people with the threat of force to force people to not pay below a certain wage. And that is wrong. It's immoral to threaten people to do something just because you think that they should do it. There's more when we come back on Peace, Love, Liberty Radio, online at fppradio.com.
Coinbase is a simple and secure online Bitcoin wallet for sending, receiving, and storing Bitcoin. Coinbase also allows you to buy and sell Bitcoin using a bank account or use their tools to accept Bitcoin as a merchant. Opening a wallet is quick and easy, and for merchants, there are no transaction fees on the first $1 million worth of transactions. Get started at coinbase.fppradio.com. You can support FPP Radio by joining the Fans program. Fans are friends, allies, and numerous supporters. Fans help FPP afford to produce more original content. You can join the fans program for as little as $3 per month or any amount of Bitcoin per month, thanks to the recurring payment options provided by Coinbase. To learn more or to join the fans program, visit fans.fppradio.com. That's FANS.fppradio.com. In 2115 New England, there are no borders, no states, and no regulations, yet never has a more peaceful and prosperous place existed. But Mr. Drake's security company has seen better days. Faced with the prospect of waning power, Mr. Drake intends to replace the anarchy of New England with a government. But at what cost? And can anyone stop him? Anarchy in New England by Joe Jarvis is available from Amazon.com and all major bookstores.
You're listening to Peace, Love, Liberty Radio with Darryl W. Perry.
It's spreading, they say, beyond the city of Los Angeles, which has already passed a law or statute, ordinance, what have you, that affects businesses in the city of Los Angeles. The Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors have approved a $15 minimum wage for anyone in Los Angeles County. New York State, with the wage board, is implementing a $15 per hour wage for fast food workers. Already, though, the article writes, there are unintended consequences in other cities. Comics Experience, a small bookstore in downtown San Francisco, has begun selling graphic novel club subscriptions in order to meet payroll. The owner, Brian Hibbs, admits members are not getting all that much for their $25 per month, but their donations are keeping him in business. He asks, I was looking at potentially having to close the doors down, and then how would I make my living? To date, he sold 228 subscriptions. He says he needs 334 subscriptions to reach his goal of $80,000 income required to cover higher labor cost. He doesn't blame San Francisco voters for approving the $15 minimum wage, but he doesn't think they had all the information needed to make a good decision. And of course, he's not going to come out and say, I blame you, San Francisco voters, because then he would basically be, shunning a large portion of his client base. And something else, just one more thing on this $15 an hour minimum wage thing before I move on to free speech zones. I find it interesting that presidential candidate Bernie Sanders, who is an advocate for the $15 per hour minimum wage, is only paying his campaign staffers $12 per hour. I have not verified this personally, but I've seen several reports of it, and I guess in theory I could call the Bernie Sanders campaign to find out, but chances are they're not going to tell me that. So it's one of these things to where you sort of have to believe the information that is being passed around and hope that the information is accurate. Now, something else that goes around, and sometimes people don't believe it to be true, is the existence of free speech zones. And this is really popular on a lot of college campuses, to where they say, oh, no, you can say whatever you want, but you have to go stand in the approved free speech area that's on the far end of campus near where nobody ever walks by, but that's the free speech area. Well, Missouri has now become the second state to prohibit the use of free speech zones on public campus, public colleges and university campuses. The story here comes from truthinmedia.com, and they write, Senate Bill 93, which was created to protect free expression on the campuses of public institutions of higher education, designates that all outdoor areas of the campus of public universities will be recognized as traditional public forums. The CAFE Act, CAFE stands for Campus Free Expression Act, and I'm guessing they're getting the A from the word campus, but for some weird reason they capitalized the A, and that just does not make sense to me. But the CAFE Act states that any individual may freely engage in non-commercial expressive activity as long as the individual's conduct is not unlawful and does not materially and substantially disrupt the institution's functioning. Which means, I take this to mean that any student can stand out and pass any information out that they want as long as it's not for commercial activity. So you want to pass out flyers advocating a rally, that's good. You want to pass out information on political candidates, you can do that. You want to collect signatures. And this does not say that it's limited to students. So in theory, political candidates could go onto campus and petition. They could collect signatures. They could pass out information on their campaign, because that is not a commercial thing. That's definitely a non-commercial expressive activity. That is not unlawful, and that does not disrupt the institution's functioning. So this is a good thing, and I wish that more states would wind up passing things similar to this. The article here continues. It says, the act, which was sponsored by Republican State Senator Ed Emery, also notes that universities may maintain and enforce reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions in service of a significant institutional interest at times when such restrictions employ clear, published content and viewpoint-neutral criteria, and provide for ample alternative means of expression. Now, this is where I sort of wind up not thinking that this is such a wonderful thing, because they could then wind up basically regulating everything and say, we're not discriminating based on content. We're just saying that nobody can do anything without our permission beforehand, and you can only stand behind a table and you can't call out from the table. Because that's what a lot of colleges do, is they won't say that there's a free speech zone. They just say you have to get permission first, and once you get permission, you have to be at a table, and the table has to be in a specific spot. You can't call out from the table. So, like if you've ever been to a fair or a carnival or anything, you know that people that are working these booths will often call out and try to get people's attention, because otherwise people walking by, they're not just going to randomly walk up, oh, hey, here's a random table, what's going on here? That they will be walking along, and they might not even notice the table. Somebody has to shout out to them, but sometimes colleges say you can't shout from the table, and they do that for everybody. It's not based on content. Nobody can shout from the table. Emery continues, Emery being the Republican state senator in Missouri that introduced this. He continues, this act may be enforced in a court of competent jurisdiction by the Attorney General or any person whose expressive rights were violated under this act. A person may recover compensatory damages, reasonable court costs, and attorney's fees. If a court finds that an institution is in violation of the new law, the CAFE Act states that it must award no less than $500 for the initial violation and $50 for each day that the violation continues. John Cohn, the Legislative and Policy Director for the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, also known as FIRE, said that while 1 in 6 public colleges in the United States uses free speech zones to restrict student speech, the CAFE Act lets Missouri statutorily ensure that its public colleges and universities will no longer be among them. FIRE noted that the CAFE Act received overwhelming bipartisan support in the Senate and was passed by a unanimous vote 34-0 before it was passed in the Missouri House of Representatives. And there's more on free speech zones and, well, the lack thereof in Virginia and Missouri.
Why do they hate us? Is libertarianism compatible with Islam? Davi Barker answers these questions and more in Voluntary Islam and Other Essays. He advances the voluntarist cause with analysis of the confluence of values between Islam and libertarianism, as well as contemporary movements from the Tea Party to the Arab Spring. Voluntary Islam by Davi Barker is available from Amazon.com and all major bookstores.
It is the year 91,001 BCE. Witness humanity's origins in Hyperchronius, a classic role-playing game for Windows PCs with a story like no other game before. A liberty-oriented experience that is not to be missed. Go to zog.ninja to get your copy of Hyperchronius today. Use the code FPP to get $1 off. Hyperchronius, zog.ninja, code FPP.
Are you tired of governments murdering people around the world? Stop using their money. There is an alternative. Bitcoin is a stateless, free market, non-political currency. Bitcoin cannot be inflated or controlled by any government. By using their money, you are helping the state. Stop doing it. You have an incredible alternative available now. Learn it, use it, spread it. Get started with Bitcoin at weusecoins.com. That's weusecoins.com.
You're listening to Peace, Love, Liberty Radio, online at fppradio.com.
Virginia was the first state to actually wind up banning free speech zones on college campuses in 2014 when they passed a law which prohibits public universities from imposing restrictions on the time, place, and manner of student speech that occurs in the outdoor areas of an institution's campus and that is protected by the First Amendment. And that's a noticeable difference between the Virginia statute and that was passed in Missouri. Let me go back up here a little bit to where the sponsor of the bill in Missouri says that institutions may maintain and enforce reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions. Whereas in Virginia, the legislature there actually prohibited public universities from imposing restrictions on the time, place, and manner of speech that has been deemed to be protected. Republican State Representative Rick Bratton, who handled the bill in the House in, I'm guessing, Missouri, says the fact of the matter remains that universities have a track record of silencing free speech, especially in cases they disagree with. He told the Missouri Times that the CAFE Act became necessary when lawmakers discovered that the West Plains campus of Missouri State University designated a basketball court near the Student Rec Center as its only free speech zone. He says free speech is not a left or a right issue. It's an individual liberty and freedom we all hold dear to our hearts. It's sad that it comes to this point that we have to pass legislation to uphold First Amendment rights. And I think that it's sad as well that you have to, pass legislation to reaffirm rights that people actually have. And I say reaffirm because the Constitution does not grant a right. The Constitution only winds up affirming a right or recognizing a right. And courts have had to keep reaffirming that, yes, people have these rights. And now, because different government entities, in this case public universities, they have said, we don't recognize that those rights exist, la, la, la. And they pretend you don't have the rights, even though everybody else says you do. So now legislators have to come out and say, no, Mr. College President Guy, they do have these rights. But again, I do not like the fact that in Missouri they are allowing them to put these time, place, and manner restrictions because that basically allows them to do whatever they want. And even though the word reasonable is there, what I find reasonable or what I find unreasonable might be considered perfectly reasonable to somebody else. So I would encourage anybody in Missouri to try to make the law even better than it is. And speaking of making things better than what it is, sometimes beer does that, right? Especially like, if you've had a long day and you're wanting to just like sit down and relax, what do? You grab a cold beer. Well, apparently people in Venezuela pretty soon are not going to be able to do that. Not because the socialist government of Venezuela has, made alcohol illegal, but because the economy in Venezuela is so incredibly horrible that they're running out of things. And they've already had problems getting toilet paper. They've had problems finding other things. People are actually smuggling product out of Venezuela because they can make more money in Colombia and Peru than what they could sell the item for in Venezuela because of price controls and things of that sort. The story here comes from USA Today, and this is actually from earlier in the month, but it only came across my radar a couple days ago. It says, throughout their country's descent into political and economic crisis, Venezuelans of all stripes have at least been able to rely on one thing: drowning their sorrows in beer. Locals of the sweltering South American nation love to down the kinds of heavily chilled light lagers popular from Mexico to Argentina. Pretty soon, Venezuela could run dry, and that could even be more devastating than it sounds. How did it come to this? Well, for one, brewery workers are on strike demanding higher wages. Members of an employment union whose name I will not try to pronounce downed tools last week, and last week actually would have been the beginning of July, at 2 bottling plants belonging to the Polar Brewery. It supplies roughly 80% of Venezuela's beer, including market leader Polar Pilsner. The union is tiny, but its members hold key positions at the plant, meaning that production has ground to a halt. The nation's human rights ombudsman has stepped in to mediate, but Empresa Polar executives accuse him of a bias towards the union, which is allied with the socialist government of President Nicolas Maduro. On top of that, there's a shortage of imported beer ingredients. Add that to the list of basics in short supply, like medicine and food, thanks to a raft of economic problems, including a lack of dollars. So far, store shelves are well stocked with beer bottles, according to the Associated Press, but that may soon change. The National Brewers Association says raw materials for beer making will run out by August. The timing could hardly be worse. Venezuela is suffering 615% inflation, according to Johns Hopkins University economist Stephen Henke. The country also has one of the world's highest homicide rates, and the government has been locking up critics. So you might think Venezuelans could use a drink. Now, if I only knew who in Venezuela I could actually wind up shipping beer to, not that I would be able to ship them a lot of beer, but, like if everybody that's listening to this show shipped like a 6-pack, then they could at least have maybe, like 5 or 6 cases of beer to wind up having a party with, right? And I realize that that's still not a lot of beer, but if you tell 3 people and they tell 3 people, then, we're still not really going to be able to help the Venezuelans with their beer crisis. And I don't think that anything is really going to be able to help the Venezuelans with their economic problems other than getting rid of the socialist government. But the problem is the people like the socialist government, or at least large chunk of the people in Venezuela like the socialist government because the socialist government is blaming America, and that's what people want to hear. Is they don't want to hear like, sorry, I screwed up. They want to hear it's somebody else's fault. You need us to protect you from the Americans. So if we could somehow like send them beer, that would be great. Don't forget the Ask Me Anything on Wednesday. Send those questions, AMA at FPP.